The cold wind cut through the abandoned stretch of roadside pines as investigators in heavy December jackets leaned over the partially exposed object, its shape barely emerging from frozen soil disturbed by the previous night's storm. Each brushed layer of dirt revealed more of the truth they feared, a truth that had waited nearly a month beneath winter's weight. Frost clung to every surface, as if guarding the secret one final time, while the team understood that this discovery, though silent and still, would redirect an investigation that had stalled at the worst possible moment in Raleigh's holiday season. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The case began on a quiet Thanksgiving weekend in 1996, when the streets of Raleigh, North Carolina, carried the usual rhythm of family gatherings, seasonal decorations, and the early signs of a city preparing for another Christmas rush. Local residents remembered that year as particularly cold, a season that seemed to settle early and firmly, casting long shadows over residential neighborhoods and the heavily wooded outskirts of Wake County. It was in this environment that a 22-year-old woman named Natalie Hargrove vanished, leaving behind a trail of questions that would torment her family and puzzle investigators for years. Natalie had been a familiar face at a small downtown gift shop, a seasonal worker who relied on holiday shifts to cover tuition for her community college courses. She was known for her quiet focus, her routine-driven nature, and her consistent communication with her mother, habits that made her disappearance stand out immediately as uncharacteristic. When she failed to return home the night before Thanksgiving, her mother contacted police early the following morning, believing at first that there might be a simple explanation. But as daylight stretched across a frosty Raleigh skyline, that hope faded quickly. The initial search efforts unfolded in a predictable yet urgent rhythm. Officers canvassed the streets near the shop where Natalie last clocked out, tracing her routine walk toward the bus stop that connected downtown to the neighborhoods on the city's eastern edge. Flyers were printed, distributed, and taped to telephone poles already crowded with holiday event posters and local business ads. Reporters from Raleigh's small but persistent local press began circling the story, pushing it out to evening broadcasts just as families prepared their Thanksgiving meals. That exposure generated public concern and a growing pool of tips, though most led nowhere. The early investigation focused heavily on Natalie's last known movements. Surveillance capability in 1996 was limited compared to modern standards, but several nearby businesses provided tapes that offered partial views of pedestrians moving along the streets that evening. Investigators studied each blurry frame, slowing grainy images to near stillness in hopes of identifying anything useful: an unfamiliar vehicle, a figure approaching her, or even an irregularity in her typical route. What they found instead was a quiet night with sparse foot traffic and no clear indication of trouble. As days passed, temperatures dropped further, and winter rain began to mix with nightly frost. The environment worked against searchers, hardening soil, obscuring potential physical evidence, and complicating grid searches. Volunteers joined officers through wooded trails, drainage paths, and fields that bordered residential developments, but the season's harshness challenged every effort. Despite this, investigators pushed forward with determination, knowing that missing person cases grew more difficult with each passing hour. Thanksgiving turned into December, bringing with it increasing anxiety and community pressure. For many older residents, especially those with long memories of earlier decades in Raleigh, the disappearance stirred an uncomfortable sense of vulnerability, cutting through the comfort typically associated with the holidays. It was not unusual for retired factory workers, longtime city employees, and military veterans to gather in coffee shops and discuss the case, reviewing details from newspapers and speculating on possible leads. Many in the 65 and older demographic felt personally invested, seeing in Natalie a reflection of their own daughters and granddaughters navigating early adulthood. Detectives continued pursuing every logical path. They conducted background checks on coworkers, reviewed Natalie's academic schedule, and examined her modest social life. Nothing suggested a high-risk lifestyle or personal conflict. She had no known romantic entanglements that could spark suspicion, and financial records revealed no concerning activity. Her life appeared stable, simple, and quiet, which made the disappearance even more perplexing. The absence of obvious motive or suspect forced investigators to broaden their scope. Vehicle sightings reported by citizens were cataloged and cross-referenced, though inconsistent descriptions and the holiday travel rush made accuracy uncertain. One witness claimed to have seen a dark pickup truck near the bus stop around the time Natalie would have arrived, but the account lacked enough detail to provide meaningful direction. Another tip suggested that a man had been asking for directions in the area weeks earlier, but this too dissolved under scrutiny. The investigation was thorough, but frustratingly unrewarding. The turning point would not come until December 23rd, when Raleigh experienced one of its most severe winter storms of the decade. Heavy rain swept through the area, followed by a sudden temperature drop that transformed water into sheets of ice. The storm toppled branches, saturated soil, and shifted surface layers throughout wooded corridors bordering the city. This shift, unpredictable, harsh, and driven by nature, became the catalyst for uncovering the evidence that had remained hidden since the night Natalie disappeared. A county maintenance worker responsible for post-storm assessment along remote roadways discovered unusual ground disturbance along a slope leading toward a drainage channel. The worker, following routine protocol, marked the location for inspection, but noted an uneasiness about the appearance of the soil and the object partially visible beneath it. When investigators arrived, their initial impressions confirmed that this site warranted immediate attention. The atmosphere during the excavation was described later in police records as tense yet controlled. Officers moved with deliberate care, aware that winter storms often exposed wildlife remains, discarded debris, or unrelated items. Still, the combination of soil displacement and the shape emerging from beneath the frost triggered their seasoned instincts. By mid-morning, the discovery of personal belongings confirmed that the site was connected to their missing person investigation. A small pendant necklace, matching descriptions provided by Natalie's mother, appeared first. Not long after, additional items were located, each reinforcing the grim certainty that this location held the answers they had been searching for. Once the area was secured and photographed, forensic specialists began their detailed work. Soil samples were collected, temperature conditions recorded, and impressions surrounding the site examined. Though the storm had altered much of the original placement, small pockets of preserved material provided crucial information. Fibers consistent with winter clothing, traces of disturbed ground consistent with human handling, and faint impressions suggesting the involvement of a vehicle were documented carefully. These findings allowed investigators to reconstruct aspects of the original event despite the environmental disruption. The medical examiner's involvement commenced shortly afterward, with remains transported under conditions designed to protect every fragment of potential evidence. Autopsy procedures revealed limited but meaningful indicators that pointed toward foul play, though the exact mechanism of death remained initially unclear. The examiner noted environmental exposure, compression factors consistent with being placed beneath soil, and subtle superficial clues that hinted at manual involvement. In accordance with legal and ethical guidelines, the autopsy report avoided speculation, but emphasized that the circumstances were highly suspicious. As Christmas approached, the city's holiday decorations stood in stark contrast to the tone of the investigation. Festive lights hung across downtown streets, while the courthouse displayed wreaths along its entryways. Yet inside the police department, the atmosphere was somber and determined. Detectives worked extended hours, transcribing interviews, correlating timelines, and revisiting earlier tips with renewed perspective. The discovery changed the entire scope of the case, shifting it from a missing person investigation to a homicide inquiry. Evidence recovered from the scene underwent forensic analysis at the state crime lab. Soil comparisons were conducted against soil collected from various potential dump sites. Fiber analysis focused on materials that did not match Natalie's clothing. Tire impression assessments, though affected by the storm, revealed approximate width patterns and tread types. Laboratory technicians pieced together microscopic findings to form a clearer picture, knowing that even the smallest detail could eventually pinpoint a suspect. Public reaction intensified quickly after authorities confirmed that human remains had been found. Local news outlets provided continuous updates, maintaining a respectful tone while acknowledging the emotional weight on the community. People gathered for candlelight vigils, and older residents attended in notable numbers, standing quietly in cold air to honor a young woman most had never met. The collective sentiment was one of mourning mixed with a deep desire for accountability. By late December, investigators turned their attention to re-examining areas of the case that previously seemed unremarkable. Minor inconsistencies in alibi statements now carried greater relevance. Backgrounds of individuals loosely connected to the case were reviewed with heightened scrutiny. Vehicle registrations matching the general description of the truck mentioned in one witness report were cross-checked. Though progress was slow, patterns began to emerge, guiding detectives toward a smaller set of persons of interest. As the year drew to a close, the investigation positioned itself at a critical threshold. The storm had revealed hidden evidence, but the full truth remained just out of reach, suspended between fragmentary clues and unresolved possibilities. Yet the foundation for eventual resolution had been laid, quietly and meticulously, as Raleigh prepared to enter a new year still burdened by a case that demanded answers. The early days of January 1997 arrived with a muted stillness over Raleigh, the kind that settles after weeks of holiday activity have exhausted the city's energy. Lights still hung in neighborhoods, though many were dimmed or switched off, as if the residents themselves felt an instinct to retreat into quiet reflection. For investigators, however, the beginning of the new year represented a crucial stage in the ongoing attempt to solve the homicide of Natalie Hargrove. With the winter storm having unearthed key physical evidence, the department now had the leverage needed to examine past details with sharper precision. Forensic analysts spent the first week of January focusing on fiber samples found near the burial site. Among them were several that did not match the clothing Natalie had been wearing at the time of her disappearance. Instead, these fibers appeared synthetic, durable, and consistent with upholstery rather than garments. Investigators noted this distinction in their reports, recognizing that such fibers often originated from older model vehicles with textured interior seating. This realization revived earlier discussions about the dark pickup truck spotted near the bus stop, prompting detectives to re-examine the limited witness descriptions that initially seemed too vague to be valuable. Parallel to the fiber analysis, tire impression assessments continued to receive attention. Though the storm had degraded much of the surrounding terrain, a few preserved areas allowed examiners to determine baseline characteristics about the tire size and tread pattern. Reports indicated that the impressions likely originated from a mid-1980s light-duty truck. Specifically, the treads exhibited a distinctive spacing pattern found on aftermarket tires that had been widely sold in hardware stores throughout the region during that period. This detail, while not definitive, assisted investigators in narrowing their focus towards specific vehicle categories, enabling database filtering that removed hundreds of irrelevant matches. Meanwhile, detectives conducted extensive interviews with individuals who had previously provided statements. Each return interview was handled with procedural care, documenting subtle shifts in demeanor or inconsistencies in recollection. The re-interviews revealed that several people remembered unfamiliar trucks traveling through residential areas during the early holiday weeks. These reports, when aggregated, indicated that a truck matching the general description had been spotted multiple times across a corridor of roads connecting downtown Raleigh to the wooded outskirts, where Natalie's remains were found. In the midst of renewed investigative traction, the medical examiner issued supplemental findings from the autopsy. While still cautious in language, the updated report emphasized that the conditions of burial, along with early decomposition indicators at the time of discovery, suggested that Natalie had likely died shortly after disappearing. Additional analysis of bone positioning and preserved tissue remnants implied she had been placed intentionally, rather than left randomly or by environmental forces. Though not explicitly describing manner of death, the report provided investigators with greater confidence in classifying the case as homicide, a classification that justified broader investigative measures and deeper scrutiny of potential suspects. Detectives also revisited workplace connections, particularly focusing on individuals who might have observed Natalie's routines. Employee records at the gift shop were reviewed comprehensively, though none of the coworkers had histories that raised red flags. Managers confirmed that staffing schedules were consistent, and no conflicts or unusual interactions had been reported during the week leading up to Thanksgiving. Natalie had been reliable, punctual, and private, characteristics that made it difficult to construct scenarios involving workplace-related motives. The investigation expanded to include a review of transit patterns along bus routes. December schedules showed that buses running through downtown experienced slight delays due to increased holiday traffic. These delays widened the window during which Natalie could have encountered a perpetrator, making the time frame less precise than investigators preferred. Still, this information allowed analysts to adjust their timeline models, refining estimates of where she might have been intercepted. Throughout mid-January, the search for the dark pickup truck intensified. Investigators coordinated with the Department of Motor Vehicles to generate lists of registered owners of suitable vehicle makes and models. Additionally, officers canvassed residential neighborhoods on foot, documenting visible trucks parked in driveways and along streets, comparing them against the criteria established by forensic findings. This methodical but time-consuming process revealed several vehicles that merited inspection, including one owned by a local tradesman whose documented travel routes intersected with locations of interest to the case. The tradesman, identified in records as a self-employed contractor, had lived in Raleigh intermittently over the past decade. His work frequently took him across rural and suburban zones surrounding the city, and maintenance logs showed that he owned a truck matching the general description reported earlier. Investigators brought him in for questioning, though not under arrest, seeking to establish a clearer understanding of his movements during the Thanksgiving holiday. He claimed to have been working sporadic jobs outside the city at the time. While this explanation was plausible, detectives noted that he could not provide verifiable documentation or corroborating witnesses to support the claim. His statements were recorded carefully, yet officers understood that suspicion alone did not constitute evidence. While pursuing this avenue, investigators also received laboratory updates indicating the presence of trace soil particles on Natalie's coat that did not match the soil at the burial site. Instead, these particles were characteristic of a clay-rich mixture found in certain industrial areas near Raleigh's western corridor. This discovery broadened the investigative map, suggesting that Natalie may have been transported or temporarily located in an area different from where she was ultimately found. Detectives reviewed zoning maps, identifying older warehouse districts and storage lots that had been active in the mid-1990s, but had since experienced turnover or abandonment. Security footage from these areas was long gone by 1997, but investigators still canvassed business owners and operators whose companies had been active during the period in question. Interviews with former employees yielded limited information, though a few recalled seeing an older dark vehicle parked near a disused loading dock on multiple occasions close to Thanksgiving. These accounts lacked precise dates, but supported the theory that an area west of downtown might represent a staging or transit point during the crime. Detectives arranged for additional forensic examination of Natalie's personal items, including the necklace retrieved from the burial site. The pendant showed minor abrasions inconsistent with simple environmental exposure. Microscopic examination revealed marks possibly caused by contact with a rough surface, potentially vehicle flooring or industrial materials. While this insight could not conclusively link the pendant to a specific location or suspect, it reinforced the broader understanding that the crime involved transportation and deliberate concealment. As winter continued, Raleigh remained gripped by the case. Older residents, particularly men who had spent decades living and working throughout Wake County, offered observations grounded in local history. Many called into radio shows or submitted letters to newspapers describing remote backroads, retired industrial sites, or shortcuts long used by contractors and tradespeople. Investigators, aware that such community input occasionally provided valuable clues, logged each suggestion and cross-referenced it with evolving case data. During the third week of January, detectives revisited the tradesman once more, this time focusing on his truck's interior. With a warrant secured based on inconsistencies in his earlier statements and his vehicle's matching characteristics, forensic teams conducted a detailed examination. The truck showed signs of wear common to older work vehicles, but several fibers recovered from its seats bore striking similarity to those found at the burial site. Additionally, soil trapped in the underside of the truck presented a mineral composition that matched both the burial location and a separate clay-rich soil sample from the western industrial corridor. The overlap of soil sources brought renewed momentum to the case. Investigators now had the opportunity to construct a more precise sequence of movements, an initial encounter likely occurring near the bus stop, followed by a possible stop or struggle in the western industrial area, and concluding with transportation to the wooded slope revealed by the storm. This reconstruction did not yet identify motive or establish a full evidentiary chain, but it provided a working hypothesis supported by forensic consistency. The tradesman, when confronted with preliminary findings, maintained that the soil on his vehicle resulted from years of work travel and that the fibers were incidental or unrelated. His responses were measured, calm, and delivered without overt defensiveness. Investigators documented his behavior, noting that his demeanor neither confirmed nor eliminated suspicion. Without DNA evidence, eyewitness accounts, or a direct link to the victim, they could not move forward with charges. Still, they intensified surveillance and continued analyzing every possible connection. As January drew to a close, tensions within the investigative unit rose. The case was progressing but slowly, and the weight of community expectation pressed heavily on the department. Retired officers occasionally visited their former precincts, offering advice based on experience. Many emphasized patience, reminding active investigators that cold cases, even newly formed ones, required tenacity rather than speed. February brought subtle shifts in the investigation. A breakthrough emerged when technicians identified a fragment of foreign material adhered to the fibers on Natalie's coat. This fragment, under microscopic analysis, proved to be a piece of hardened adhesive commonly used in carpentry and building repair during the mid-1990s. The composition of the adhesive matched substances frequently found in small-scale contractor workshops, further increasing interest in individuals with such background. Additional laboratory testing revealed faint traces of machine oil on Natalie's jeans, oil consistent with equipment maintenance environments rather than consumer products. Investigators correlated this with the industrial West Side zone and the tradesman's occupation, tightening the circumstantial framework surrounding him. Still, they understood that each new fragment of evidence required corroboration before it could substantiate legal action. Detectives revisited maps and timelines with renewed precision, incorporating traffic patterns, daylight hours, and estimated durations between key locations. They constructed models of the suspect's possible routes using data from seasonal road conditions, truck wear patterns, and known stop points. This modeling suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with specific backroads seldom used by general commuters, reinforcing the belief that the suspect possessed long-term local knowledge. Community involvement persisted, driven by a desire for closure and justice. Older residents continued to engage deeply, reading newspaper updates and discussing theories over morning coffee. Many expressed a steady conviction that the truth was nearing the surface, just as the storm had brought buried evidence into view. By the end of February, the foundation for a decisive breakthrough was forming, though investigators did not yet realize that a single overlooked detail would soon shift the case dramatically and push it toward eventual resolution. March arrived with a thin veil of early pollen drifting across Raleigh's neighborhoods, though winter lingered in colder pockets of shade beneath aging oak trees and behind brick storefronts downtown. The gradual seasonal transition brought renewed public activity, yet the Hargrove case remained a fixture of discussion among residents who followed each development with persistent concern. Police investigators continued sifting through the expanding web of forensic clues, witness recollections, and behavioral patterns, determined to bridge the gap between strong suspicion and conclusive proof. One of the most significant advancements during early March emerged from a re-examination of the soil and clay samples found on Natalie's clothing and the tradesman's truck. A state geologist consulted by investigators noted subtle mineral stratification within the sample that suggested not only the geographic region, but also a specific type of excavation site. This stratification included trace amounts of red silty clay mixed with sand fragments commonly associated with older foundation dig sites, the type often present beneath demolished or repurposed warehouse structures. The detail aligned with earlier suspicions regarding the industrial corridor west of downtown, offering investigators a more precise classification of potential locations. Armed with this geological insight, detectives embarked on a renewed field inspection of the West Side industrial zone. Many of the buildings from the 1980s and earlier had been torn down or converted into storage facilities, but several lots remained in transitional states, either awaiting redevelopment or serving as unofficial dumping grounds for construction materials. Officers walked each site, photographing soil disturbances, abandoned foundations, drainage channels, and access paths. Among these sites, one particular property, a partially cleared lot that once housed a modest carpentry workshop, caught investigators' attention. The lot featured a loading dock, overgrown brush, and exposed earth that visually resembled the soil profile outlined by the geologist. Additionally, tire tracks of varying ages crisscrossed the property, suggesting intermittent vehicular activity over the years. Though no evidence directly connected this lot to the tradesman, its characteristics warranted further examination. Detectives collected soil samples for laboratory comparison, documented tire impressions, and mapped the connecting roads to determine whether the lot could logically fit within a suspect's route between downtown, an intermediate stop, and the remote burial location. Early assessments indicated that its position aligned well with the theoretical movement pattern previously deduced. This alignment added weight to the emerging framework investigators were constructing, but it still left essential components unresolved. During the same period, forensic analysts continued evaluating the hardened adhesive fragment discovered on Natalie's coat. Chemical profiling revealed a compound mixture used primarily in the mid-1990s by small-scale contractors, particularly those specializing in general repair assignments rather than large commercial construction. The report emphasized that although the adhesive was common in trades environments, the specific combination of resin and filler materials matched only certain manufacturers. Distribution records obtained from regional hardware suppliers showed that one such adhesive brand had been sold extensively in Raleigh's western corridor, including a subset of stores frequented by the tradesmen under scrutiny. Investigators approached this data cautiously, aware that circumstantial evidence required extensive corroboration before contributing to prosecutorial direction. Meanwhile, community engagement continued shaping the investigation in subtler ways. Letters to the editor of local newspapers frequently referenced long-standing knowledge of rural shortcuts, abandoned service roads, or old workshop sites familiar to older workers. Some residents noted that several tradespeople in Raleigh's outskirts often used informal workspaces or storage sheds on land that did not belong to them, a habit that sometimes avoided rental fees or zoning constraints. Detectives reviewed these claims against public property records, identifying parcels that might warrant inspection. Their methodical cross-referencing of informal community knowledge with formal investigative data revealed a pattern pointing toward specific regions of interest, though not yet toward a definitive suspect. The most consequential development of March did not, however, arise from soil, adhesive, or public tips. Instead, it originated from the meticulous reprocessing of Natalie's belongings. With forensic techniques improving even within the span of a few years, laboratories occasionally revisited older cases to apply updated testing procedures. In this instance, a faint trace substance embedded in the fibers of Natalie's jacket underwent renewed testing using more sensitive analytical equipment. The result revealed microscopic deposits of a lubricant compound commonly used in older carpentry tools, specifically table saws and planers. The chemical signature contained trace amounts of metal particulates that suggested prolonged exposure to a workshop environment. This revelation prompted detectives to examine the tradesman's occupational history more closely. Records indicated that he had previously worked in a woodworking environment during the early 1990s, before transitioning to general contracting. Moreover, a background check revealed that he had rented a small workshop space in the West Side industrial corridor during that earlier period, though the rental agreement had not been renewed in several years. The workshop, now abandoned and partially demolished, matched the geographic profile established by soil analysis and the pattern of tire impressions at the suspected intermediate site. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the remains of the workshop, focusing on any preserved materials that could connect the tradesman to the crime. The site, though degraded by weather and time, still retained remnants of flooring, support beams, and scattered debris. Forensic teams collected samples of sawdust, oil stains, metal fragments, and adhesive residue. They also photographed the spatial layout, noting areas where equipment had once been mounted and where materials might have accumulated. The search extended into the gravel surrounding the structure, capturing soil and rock samples for comparison. The overarching goal was to determine whether the environment in which the tradesman had once worked corresponded to the trace materials found on Natalie's clothing. While laboratory processing continued, detectives reviewed timeline reconstructions with renewed scrutiny. They mapped the tradesman's historical addresses, known work sites, and documented travel patterns. They consulted old municipal records identifying which roads had been open or under repair during 1996, integrating this information into their movement hypotheses. This careful reconstruction revealed a potential route from downtown Raleigh to the industrial workshop, then toward the wooded burial site. The time frame of the evening before Thanksgiving aligned with the bus schedule delays. The industrial corridors reduced activity, and the relative isolation of the workshop lot during holiday hours. Despite this mounting circumstantial framework, investigators knew the case still lacked a direct link compelling enough for arrest. The district attorney's office emphasized the necessity of forensic evidence capable of withstanding courtroom scrutiny, particularly given the complexities of relying on environmental trace elements. As a result, detectives focused intensely on identifying physical evidence that had been preserved, intentionally or otherwise, in the tradesman's vehicle or former workshop. In mid-March, laboratory reports on the adhesive samples collected from the workshop were finalized. The chemical composition matched the fragment found on Natalie's coat with remarkable precision. The match held across several components of the compound mixture, including resin ratios and specific fillers unique to one manufacturer. This alignment surpassed the threshold of coincidence and significantly strengthened the investigative case. Additional comparisons between the metal particulates found in the jacket fibers and those extracted from workshop debris revealed corresponding alloy properties associated with specific woodworking tools. These connections indicated not only presence within a similar environment, but exposure to the same type of equipment used by the tradesman during his earlier occupation. Meanwhile, tire impression comparisons progressed as analysts discovered that one of the older impressions at the workshop lot exhibited tread patterns nearly identical to those at the burial site. Given the degradation of both sets of impressions, the match could not be declared absolute, but the similarities were consistent enough for investigators to incorporate into their broader evidentiary structure. This finding further connected the tradesman's historical workspace to the sequence of movements implicated in the crime. By late March, investigators assembled a multidisciplinary review session involving forensic analysts, geologists, crime scene specialists, and prosecutorial consultants. The session sought to integrate each fragment of evidence into a cohesive narrative, identifying areas of confidence and gaps that still required reinforcement. Participants reviewed soil origins, adhesive composition, metal particulate analysis, fiber matches, tire impressions, workshop layout, vehicle interior findings, and the suspect's inconsistent statements. The collective conclusion indicated that all significant evidence clusters converged on a single individual whose known movements, occupational history, and access patterns aligned with every major element of the reconstructed timeline. During this period, detectives also revisited several minor leads previously overshadowed by larger forensic developments. One such lead involved a former coworker of the tradesman who, upon re-interview, recalled an incident from late 1996 involving abrupt truck cleaning shortly after the Thanksgiving holiday. The coworker described the tradesman as appearing tense and working quietly for several hours, cleaning the truck bed using solvents typically reserved for tool maintenance. The coworker had not found the behavior suspicious at the time, but in retrospect, the detail resonated strongly with investigators. Another lead emerged from a former property owner near the wooded burial site, who reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked along the slope approximately 1 or 2 days after the storm. Though the sighting occurred weeks after the crime and could not confirm involvement, the report confirmed local residents' awareness of vehicular activity in the area historically connected to the case. Forensic staff continued working through remaining samples, evaluating overlooked particles, reevaluating chemical profiles, and comparing soil composites from each site. Their work revealed an additional small but significant discovery: microscopic traces of dried botanical material adhered to fibers from Natalie's sweater. The material belonged to a species of plant commonly found near the workshop site but not prevalent near the burial slope or the bus stop. This detail further strengthened the theory that Natalie had been present at or transported through the workshop environment before being taken to the final burial location. As March ended, investigators prepared to approach the tradesman once again. However, this time they carried with them a nearly complete evidentiary structure, one built on geology, chemistry, occupational history, witness recollections, and the physical behavior of vehicles and materials across Raleigh's winter landscape. The foundation was strong enough to shift the investigation from suspicion to impending resolution, though detectives remained committed to ensuring that every final step adhered to the procedural integrity required for prosecution. With spring approaching and the city shedding the last remnants of winter, the case was poised to reach a turning point that had eluded investigators for months. The storm that had revealed the initial evidence had only been the beginning. Now, the full truth was preparing to surface through the accumulated weight of methodical forensic inquiry and unwavering investigative persistence. April arrived with warmer mornings and a steady hum of seasonal renewal across Raleigh. Flowering dogwoods brightened residential streets, and outdoor markets began opening along familiar sidewalks. Yet within the police department, the Hargrove case commanded an unbroken sense of gravity. Months of meticulous work had narrowed the investigative lens to a single focal point: a tradesman whose history, behavior, and physical environment aligned with the accumulating forensic evidence. What remained was the crucial task of transforming this circumstantial weight into a legally definitive conclusion. In early April, detectives coordinated a controlled interview session with the tradesman, supported by the presence of forensic analysts and a representative from the district attorney's office. The purpose was not to seek confession, but to resolve minor discrepancies in his prior statements and, critically, to observe his reactions to new questions about the workshop site. Investigators approached the interview calmly, adhering to procedural neutrality while structuring their questions around established timelines, geographic movements, and occupational patterns. The tradesmen responded with practiced composure, though subtle behavioral indicators, prolonged pauses, diverted eye contact, and shifts in posture were documented to supplement the overall assessment. He continued asserting that his work around Thanksgiving involved out-of-town contracting, insisting the truck's soil and fibers reflected normal wear accumulated over years. Nevertheless, his inability to provide corroborative evidence reinforced investigators' concerns. Following the interview, detectives obtained judicial authorization to examine storage facilities rented by the tradesmen during the mid-1990s. Many contractors in Raleigh maintained off-site units for tools and project materials, and rental records indicated that he had used such a facility on the western edge of the city. The unit, now vacant but still accessible through records and archival keys, contained remnants of woodworking supplies, adhesive containers, and disassembled shelving units coated with layers of dust. Forensic teams collected samples from every surface, focusing on adhesive residue, sawdust deposits, and any material capable of producing comparative matches. The adhesive tests revealed compound signatures identical to the fragment recovered from Natalie's clothing, aligning with earlier findings from the abandoned workshop site. Even with this growing evidentiary framework, investigators sought one more layer of verification. A deeper forensic evaluation of the tradesman's pickup truck was ordered, targeting areas often overlooked during routine cleaning. Under seat cushions, behind interior paneling, and within narrow floorboard seams, technicians discovered additional fibers consistent with those recovered at the burial location. Moreover, minute flecks of soil found in the wheel well displayed the same clay-silt composition identified at the workshop site. While none of these discoveries alone provided definitive proof, their cumulative weight significantly reinforced the investigative conclusion. In mid-April, a pivotal laboratory report arrived, altering the trajectory of the case decisively. Analysts had conducted DNA testing on minute biological traces found on Natalie's necklace. The material was minimal, barely enough for analysis given the passage of time and environmental exposure, but the laboratory succeeded in isolating a partial genetic profile. The profile excluded numerous individuals interviewed throughout the investigation, yet crucially, when compared against the tradesman's DNA obtained through a legally sanctioned procedure, analysts identified a match. Although the genetic profile was partial, it met the threshold for evidentiary significance, providing the biological linkage that investigators had previously lacked. The combination of DNA correspondence, environmental trace alignment, vehicle evidence, adhesive matches, soil stratification, and occupational context formed a coherent and scientifically supported narrative. After reviewing the completed evidentiary package, the district attorney filed charges. The tradesman was arrested on a clear spring morning, taken into custody without incident. The public announcement of the arrest brought a wave of response throughout Raleigh, particularly among older residents who had followed the case from its earliest days. Local newspapers, grounded in a tone of measured relief, reported the arrest while acknowledging the long journey that had led investigators from a winter storm to the courtroom. The pretrial process unfolded with procedural precision. Prosecutors outlined the chronological sequence of evidence, emphasizing the interdisciplinary consistency across geology, chemistry, trace forensics, and behavioral analysis. Defense counsel attempted to challenge the reliability of environmental trace evidence and the integrity of the partial DNA profile, arguing that years of exposure could have compromised materials and introduced contamination. However, forensic experts testified to the rigorous chain of custody procedures followed during collection and analysis, presenting detailed explanations of how environmental variables were accounted for, and how the genetic material remained valid despite its minimal quantity. One of the most compelling components presented at trial involved the geological testimony. Experts described the specificity of the soil stratification found on Natalie's clothing, the burial site, and the tradesman's truck. Their analysis showed that the combination of red silty clay, sand fragments, and mineral deposits aligned with only a handful of locations in the region, including the workshop site historically used by the tradesman. Tire impression analyses, though not absolute, supported the route reconstruction, while adhesive specialists described the near-impossible likelihood that the compound on Natalie's coat originated from any source other than the material recovered from the workshop. Testimony from former coworkers also factored significantly into the proceedings. Several recalled the tradesman's abrupt cleaning of his truck shortly after Thanksgiving, the quietness of his demeanor during that period, and his lack of involvement in typical holiday gatherings. Others described his familiarity with remote backroads, particularly those leading from the industrial corridor toward wooded outskirts. While these recollections did not serve as standalone proof, they collectively illustrated a context consistent with the prosecution's timeline. The medical examiner presented findings related to environmental exposure, soil compression indicators, and burial characteristics. Though the precise cause of death could not be conclusively determined due to time and environmental factors, the examiner's explanation of the burial process and the manner in which Natalie had been intentionally placed supported the prosecution's classification of homicide. The examiner reiterated that the circumstances could not be reconciled with accidental death or self-directed movement, leaving intentional concealment as the only reasonable interpretation. After several weeks of testimony, analysis, and cross-examination, the evidence presented exceeded the threshold required for conviction. The jury, comprised of residents from across Wake County, deliberated for a period notable more for its thoroughness than its length. Their verdict, guilty on charges of murder and unlawful concealment, brought a long-awaited sense of resolution to a case that had weighed heavily on the community. The tradesman received a life sentence under North Carolina law, with eligibility for parole removed due to the severity of the conviction and the aggravating factors associated with concealment. In the aftermath of the trial, Raleigh's atmosphere shifted from tension to quiet reflection. Local newspapers published retrospective articles detailing the investigative journey, emphasizing the persistence of detectives, the advancement of forensic science, and the critical role of environmental evidence. Older residents, many of whom had followed the case through every season, expressed a deep sense of closure. In interviews with community reporters, some reflected on how the case had stirred memories of earlier decades when disappearances were rare and communities maintained closer vigilance. For them, the resolution carried symbolic weight, reaffirming that methodical investigation could still prevail in cases complicated by time and circumstance. The wooded area where Natalie had been found remained undisturbed following the completion of trial proceedings. Out of respect, no public memorial was constructed, and the land was left in its natural state. Family members, preferring privacy, visited quietly on occasion, choosing to grieve beyond the attention of the media. Investigators, meanwhile, archived the case file with a mixture of professional satisfaction and solemn recognition of the loss at its center. For many of them, the storm that had revealed the initial evidence remained a defining memory, an unexpected catalyst that transformed a case slipping toward cold status into a solvable sequence of forensic clues. Over time, the case earned recognition among law enforcement circles for its demonstration of multidisciplinary forensic integration. Training seminars referenced the soil stratification findings, adhesive compound comparisons, and reconstruction of vehicle movement through seasonal conditions. The case underscored how environmental forces, such as storms and seasonal shifts, could reveal crucial evidence that human searches might overlook. It also highlighted the importance of revisiting assumptions, exploring abandoned industrial spaces, and leveraging geologic expertise in advancing complex investigations. As the years passed, Raleigh continued evolving, with new development rising in areas once dominated by aging warehouses and rural woodland. Streets grew busier, businesses changed ownership, and neighborhoods welcomed new generations of residents. Yet the memory of the investigation lingered quietly in the background of local history, preserved in archived editions of newspapers, courthouse records, and the recollections of those who had lived through the winter months of 1996 and 1997. Ultimately, the case stood as a testament to perseverance. The perseverance of a community unwilling to let a young woman's disappearance fade into obscurity. The perseverance of investigators who followed every clue regardless of how small or fragmented. And the perseverance of forensic science steadily advancing toward greater precision. The storm that had revealed the evidence became an enduring reminder that truth sometimes emerges through unexpected forces, uncovered not by dramatic discovery, but through patient, unrelenting attention to detail. In the end, resolution did not bring celebration, nor could it erase the grief experienced by Natalie's family. But it did restore a measure of order, affirming that in a season marked by loss, justice had ultimately prevailed. The case closed quietly, without ceremony, leaving behind a legacy grounded in diligence, scientific rigor, and the unwavering pursuit of answers across Raleigh's winter landscape.